first and foremost, please introduce yourself. Thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you for having me on. So I am a transgender journalist who covers legislation, cultural issues, major news around the globe. I track healthcare clinics. I report on laws and bills in the United States as well as abroad. And generally, I write as much as I can and try to tell our stories as best as I can.
Wonderful, wonderful. I have been reading through your entire Substack, which I hadn't even really understood what Substack was until a couple creators recently started using it, yourself included. And the way that you document so thoroughly, I think not only is it important now, but I think especially in a few years' time, maybe even decades, that kind of historical record of everything that's happening is, especially retrospectively, going to be so important. So
yeah, so like I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that, because I've been asked before, like, why I do what I do. And one of the reasons, one of the answers is to help people understand what's going on right now and to help, both trans and cis people get a good grasp on the news and the major events and like all of the information that's out there. But also, increasingly, I am taking the long view on things, that we are in a very particular time and place right now where there's a lot of danger and where really, harmful things are happening. And I want to make sure that 10, 20, 50 years from now, we have a record of what happened here, like how we got to this point and whatever happens next. And so, yeah, I'm glad that you noticed that. That's really, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from a personal perspective, as a trans woman, I appreciate that in general, but just on the wider scheme of things, like you said, I think it's going to be so crucial, especially looking at, I don't want to say the G word too soon in the conversation, but looking at things happening across the globe, things that happened in the past. I think what's happening to the trans community and the anti-trans movement, which is what I want to talk about today, obviously, is going to be retrospectively looked at as quite a serious thing. Tell us about yourself and the work you do currently.
So my name is Erin Reed. I am a transgender journalist. I cover all of the legislation, the cultural moments, the major news around this topic. I do it for my subscription newsletter, Erin in the Morning. I also have a large following on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and I try to basically get our stories, the stories of the trans and queer community, out in as many mediums as possible, meeting people where they are, both physically, so on the platforms that they consume this news at, and also mentally, where they're at in their own personal journey towards trans acceptance, towards LGBTQ acceptance. My content does not assume that my audience knows everything. And my content does not assume that my audience agrees with everything. Instead, I write and I present information in such a way that can, in my hopes, help the audience move to a place of greater understanding.
That's wonderful and fantastic. And the bit you just mentioned about not assuming everyone knows everything, I think is so fantastic and poignant, because especially, even I've seen myself on YouTube, it can feel like we're repeating the same points. And I often, when I'm live, I always say, like, am I saying the same thing again and again? But, people are coming in waves. People are learning as they go. And it's so important how, I'd like to try and keep my arms open to everyone. And, it's so clear that you're doing the same thing, and that's so much appreciated.
My fiance, she actually was a dance instructor for a long time. Oh, nice. And one thing that she says is that, or one thing that she's told me before is that whenever you're practicing a dance, it sometimes can feel whenever you're performing that like you're doing the same thing that you've done a million times before. But for every single person that watches you perform, for every single person that watches you dance in every individual place that you do so, they're seeing you for the first time. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind whenever we present information. To us, it might feel like we have covered this a bajillion times and that, this feels old. But for many people, they're new. They're new to all of this. Some people are newly coming out and they need that information too.
That is an amazing point and a fantastically beautiful analogy. Yeah, I completely agree. That's very poignant. And congrats, by the way. I obviously it's the first time I get to say it, but congrats to you two. That's so wonderful and magical, and just
Thank you.
any form of trans joy, just joy in general at the moment, like, is so good to be celebrating.
She is my joy.
Oh, that's don't, you're gonna get me crying in a minute. We got so much like negative stuff to talk about. We can't be this happy and merry.
I will latch on to as much positivity as I possibly can.
We just need to right now. I know, honestly, yeah, no,
Absolutely.
same. It's oh god. Well, I mean, we're gonna get into it. So for the question two, I've got I want to start open and then kind of specifically pinpoint some stuff. But for those unaware, walk us through exactly what an anti-trans bill is. We're going to talk about this in more depth, but more like we were just saying, for someone who's not quite aware of the US kind of system, legal system, like what is an anti-trans bill? What is a bill in general?
Yeah. So in the United States, in order for something to become a law, it has to be proposed. And most states have essentially two places it can be proposed. It can be proposed in the House, which are representatives that usually serve shorter periods, or in the Senate, which has senators that serve longer periods. And they release a bill. It goes through committees and they workshop the bill and then they vote on it. They pass it to the other house and they vote on it, and then it potentially becomes law if it gets signed by the governor. And so an anti-trans bill, or at least what I track as anti-trans bills, are bills that seek to roll back rights, protections, civil ways of life for transgender people in a large variety of ways. And so what are these kinds of ways? How do these bills affect trans people? I'm tracking 45 different categories of bills. We've seen, a large explosion of bills in the last 4 years, whereas in 2020, there were maybe 12 bills. In 2024, we are now pushing 500 this year, in combination with 550 last year. And these bills do everything from ban teachers from having a pride flag at their desk to allowing the banning of books that have LGBTQ characters in them from school libraries. We see bills that ban transgender people from bathrooms of their gender identity, including one in Florida that would arrest trans people and put them in jail for up to a year if they are found in a bathroom that doesn't match their assigned sex at birth, a bathroom that I've been using for years now. We also see bills that ban medical care. So these are things like hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and surgery. Many times these are for transgender teenagers, but also we see bills that target transgender adults as well on this front. We have bills that end legal recognition for trans people that basically say that no longer are trans people going to be legally treated as their gender identity in any laws. This includes things like driver's licenses, where in Florida we see the potential charging of trans people that have their correct gender marker with criminal fraud, for instance, and having their licenses revoked. It specifically says that their driver's licenses could be revoked. And so these are just a small sample of the just dozens and dozens of bills. In Iowa, I would give one more. In Iowa, there was recently a bill that would force trans people to have a special gender marker on their driver's licenses. Basically, it was dubbed the pink triangle bill, the bill that would essentially force identification of trans people. I want to also close off by saying that these are bills, but there are also other ways that trans people can be targeted in the United States. For instance, we have attorney generals who can sort of just do things that are not necessarily provided to them by the law. At least they're willing to. For instance, we see Attorney General Ken Paxton of Texas has recently subpoenaed one of our nation's largest LGBTQ kids groups, PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and basically asked PFLAG to provide membership rolls, to provide basically lists of all the members in Texas that are trans. You can see where this gets really dicey, and that's what we're experiencing right now in the United States.
Well, gosh, I've got a few questions about some of those points. So as much as I want to talk about them now, they will pop up, especially like the gender markers and stuff like that. But thank you for such an amazing overarching summary of what's happening. So,
of course,
for a bill, then, just from also my understanding, so from like A to Z, it's basically some form of right wing or Republican or anti-trans body person or lobbyist will go to, you said, the House, and they can just prepare these bills themselves, can't they? So a lot of them are completely just kind of drafted by someone, sometimes with errors, sometimes with things that don't make sense. And then they can just submit them in any form to. How does it work? So in the US, is it just per state's kind of legal body? Like, who do they present them to?
Yeah. And I think this is definitely one of the unique aspects of the United States, is that every single state can almost be considered its own country in a way, in that it can pass its own laws. Now, these laws can't conflict with the United States Constitution, and this is where we get into constitutional fights with state laws. And so you have an interesting situation right now in the United States where roughly half of the country is really, really rough for trans people. Would be considered, I think, more regressive than many countries that have, very negative views towards LGBTQ people. And then on the other side of things, roughly half of the country is some of the most accepting places on earth for trans people. We see places like California, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maryland, my own home state, where there are laws that have been passed that protect trans people within the borders. And in fact, we're even seeing right now, some state laws are passing protections for people leaving other state laws.
Yes.
And so, we've got this interesting dynamic where the country is kind of at odds right now over transgender people. And this is going to play out in the presidential election, because we also have national laws. We have federal laws that can be passed in a very similar way to these state laws. And, Republicans have indicated that they want to try to get national anti-trans legislation passed. And that would be very, very troublesome.
Right. Yeah. So this is another thing. So this is what I've seen on your legislation risk assessment map, which we'll get to. Can't wait to talk about. But yeah, so there's almost like this positive counteraction that's actively protecting against the laws that would take away so that even getting my words right. So the anti-trans laws that are like, even if you move state, we will follow you or take your information. There are some progressive, some kind of protective laws that are like, you can't even do that. Someone has a safe haven in this state if they're trans. So it's really a conflict of borders and, like you say, states that are larger than most countries, especially coming from someone that lived in the UK and lives now in Japan. Like, these places are huge to me on a scale of like, uncomprehendable that they're just classed as states,
Well, right. And, even, we see places like Texas, Florida, and more, where they're pretty far away from many of these states that have positive legislation, especially in the case of Florida, where, the southern tip of Florida, you're in a peninsula. There's no going to safe states left or right, west or east. You've got to travel very, very far away. And we even have organizations right now whose sole purpose is to help fly people from Florida to, say, Massachusetts, where they can get gender affirming care. And there are people right now. There was just a story by the Rolling Stone that interviewed families that are flying with their trans teen every 3 months to like a state 1,000, 2,000 miles away just to get their care, because that care was banned in Florida.
Insane. Absolutely insane. And again, this will come up later, but when you consider the proportion of the trans community in numbers, it's so mind-blowing. Anyway, tell me more.
We're not a huge minority. Like, we're a fairly small but tenacious group of people.
Small but powerful.
And and we've got, like, it's really easy. We don't have the funding. We don't have the lobbyists. We don't have the entire sort of right-wing infrastructure that they've got. We've got to kind of fend for ourselves.
Absolutely, which is why allyship is so important.
Absolutely.
For sure. So tell me more about the Adult Trans Legislative Risk Assessment Map, which was also the kind of youth version of such. I'd love to hear about that. And you've got a legislation tracker as well. Tell me more about that kind of work you're doing.
Absolutely. So starting about 3 years ago, I began getting messages from concerned parents saying, hey, I'm in this state. Like, is it time for me to move? Is it time for me to get out of here? And this is before the really bad laws were passing. This is like whenever we first started getting information on them. And as the laws started to pass, I started getting those messages more and more and more. And every single person had unique circumstances. Like, for instance, somebody might be in Alabama and doesn't have a lot of money. And so they might not be able to move very far away. Whereas some people are looking at colleges and just trying to find out which state they should go to. And so I found myself spending a lot of time answering people's questions because I try to answer as much as possible from people that reach out to me. And eventually this led to me just saying, okay, I'm going to create a resource that's going to help this and that's going to maybe help a lot of people. And so I did. I created a map that I have a rubric that I look at various laws that are in each state. I look at the risk of more laws passing. I talk to activists in each state. I've got contacts in all 50 states on this issue. And I assess the risk. And I've been continually updating this map. It started out with trans youth. The map was mainly focused on young trans people because we didn't have any laws targeting trans adults for the most part. That changed as of last year. We started getting laws that target trans adults very heavily. And so I then shifted my map to focus on all trans people, which include trans adults. Now, this map will show that the country has really, again, bifurcated into sort of two Americas. We have one America where you will face your driver's license potentially being revoked, where you'll have your ability to exist in public very, very hampered, very hard to go out in public if you can't use a bathroom safely, for instance, where you might have your medical care targeted. We see in Florida, 80% of trans adults have lost, their main medical provider. And so this is what we're seeing. And I made this map. And what I will say is that I've seen amazing use cases for the map. I've had a lot of people contact me and thank me for it because they were able to make decisions for their kids. Like, for instance, very commonly I hear, hey, thank you so much for this map. Because of you, my son or daughter or I chose to go to college in Minnesota. And that really helped me make that decision. I also have spoken at Fortune 500 companies where I've shared the map, and this map has been used to make conference decisions. The map has been used to, make business decisions. And people are really using this as a resource. And I'm really happy that I've been able to make this resource available.
For sure. I mean, the fact that you're seeing results from, families to just general people to companies, it shows that no one else is doing this. You are doing this of your own time, your own free will. You're, one person, and yet you're the only one doing that. That to me is quite interesting in the fact that in the entirety of the United States, there isn't a charity, an organization, even with the ability to do that. And even if they are, yours is the one being used, that's a huge accolade to you. And like, honestly, I can't show my amazement enough, honestly. Like, I'm not even in the US and I find that amazing.
I greatly appreciate that. It's work. It's hard work. It is hard work, both physically, because there's so much time that I need to spend at a computer, at a desk, so many late nights, like till 2:50 in the morning. And it's also hard work mentally because I think more than anybody in the United States, have watched more anti-trans hearings and seen more hateful rhetoric on a daily basis for 5 years that I've been covering this issue. And that's hard. It's exceptionally hard. But I'll also say that I am doing this to hopefully spare as many other people from having to do this as possible. And the things that I can gain from this and the things that I can provide from this are things that I hope help both the trans and queer community find safety and the allies and potential allies move to a place of better understanding. I'll also add that this is not the only map that I've created. Another major map that I've been a part of is my trans-informed consent hormone therapy access map. And that map has been, I made it 5 years ago. And I'm actually, let's see, I would like to actually, I'll share it with you afterwards. But
Yes,
the map looks at all of the clinics in the United States where you could get your care. And prior to that map, actually, these were scattered all over the web. You couldn't really find where a close clinic was. I had to drive 3 hours away and then 3 hours back, so 6 hours round trip just to get my hormone therapy early on. And these clinics, they are informed consent, so they're for adults, and they essentially don't have like the extensive 2 years of wait time that you see with like, hospital associated clinics. And over 7 million views on this map. I've been told every day that it's helped people with their transition. And I want to add that I have been able to watch as more and more clinics open up, not just in the United States, but also internationally. One of the things that I was really happy for is that last year I added my first informed consent clinic in Japan. And that was really cool. Like, it's cool to see that like there is still advancement being made. Like there are still areas where things are getting perhaps a little bit better, or at least this small aspect of things are getting better. I added clinics in Australia. I added my first clinics in Canada. I added some in Spain. Like, we are seeing, despite all of this rhetoric, places where we can perhaps find a little bit of hope.
For sure. And I think what you were saying earlier about being the person that has to watch all of this anti-trans rhetoric, it can get you down. It can affect your mental health.
One of the things that I do, and I know we're going to be talking about, and we already have talked about very heavy stuff, but one of the things that I really try to do in my writing, in my reporting on TikTok, in my videos, is not just blast my audience with a constant fire hose of, bad stuff, of the ways in which we are harmed. I try to make my content empowering. I try to find the stories of hope. I try to find, the ways in which we can fight back. And that's what I focus on, and I'll always focus on that.
Yeah, I've seen how you use your color system, and I watched your reel a while ago that said, like, bear in mind I try to do the positive stuff, but there's not much positive stuff happening. So if you see my red light in the background, it's because stuff's getting real, Yeah.
Whenever we get into these negative periods, I always have to just be like, hey, look, this is the current situation on the ground right now.
Which we can laugh and we're smiling about, but that's because of the it can be not funny, but it's like, it's so bad that we have to put this mask on of smiling. And I've said a lot about that on my live streams. It's like, I'm not happy about the situation. I'm having to find a happiness to be that ray of hope to people. So I can see that in you, and I think why we can laugh about it. But obviously from someone watching it, it's a bit weird that we're laughing. But yeah.
I think I think that sort of laughing at the ridiculous of it all and laughing at the magnitude of it all it's a sensation that, like, despite all of this, we are still here and we are still fighting.
Exactly.
And we have to come every day bringing our whole selves to this picture where we then deal with all of this stuff. And we've seen it all. And we know it's sort of like that sensation of knowing where this is all coming from. And as somebody like you and I, who constantly cover this, who look at these issues, it's ridiculous, the things that get brought up time and time again that we continue to have to address, to rebut, to debunk, to fact check. And yeah, you do have to laugh at it. I think that you do sometimes have to laugh in the face of it, because that's part of showing your own internal joy and strength and resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, no, I completely agree. We're also like, there's covering it as a creator, and then there's also like, we are affected by it too. And I'm allowed my reaction of how it actually affects me, if that makes sense. Like the post you did recently about J.K. Rowling made her overtly brazen and shameless transphobic comment about the UK trans activist India, and I laughed out loud at the jump we've had from, we've come a long way since wear what you want but just don't say sex isn't real, to full on the vanguard of transphobic rhetoric of like, now we're cosplaying as our fetishized version of what men want to see. It's like, anyway, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that. Insane. We could talk about J.K. Rowling for like 3 hours. in the video essay I've got coming up, a large portion of what I wanted to talk about is Chaya Rychek, Ryan Walters, and the tragedy that happened to Next Benedict. The information that's coming out about that at the point of filming is still kind of being looked into, as you've covered so closely on your blog. I also came across a post you did about the other people affected. Brianna J, I think it's pronounced as well, obviously from the UK. Eden Knight, Ariana Michelle, I think. Let's talk about Next Benedict and what happened there, the Chaya Rychek thing. And then I also want to talk about representation of trans youth. And you can probably see where I'm going with it, but you mentioned it even yourself, the lack of full coverage of all trans youth being affected by this anti-trans movement is something I'm just really passionate about. But before we get into that, so let's talk about what happened with Next Benedict, the physical effects of this anti-trans movement now that are forever. That's happened. It's a terrible stain on history. What's your opinion of the responsibility and accountability that should be, held accountable by Ryan Walters and Chaya Rychek and everyone involved?
So earlier we spoke about the states and like how some are going into really positive directions and some are going into really negative ones. And on my map, I tracked the negative ones in red. And Oklahoma is one of the deepest, darkest shades of red where this tragedy occurred. And it is a tragedy what happened to Next Benedict. So just to give your audience a little bit of background as to what we know at the time of this recording, is that Next Benedict was a trans and non-binary individual in Owasso Public Schools. We did later learn, and I will use for this, for the purposes of this discussion, he pronouns, although we know that he used he, they pronouns primarily. And we later learned that, he went into a bathroom, the bathroom of his assigned sex at birth, so the girls' bathroom, and in that bathroom, according to video taken from the hospital later, he explains that he was teased for the way that he dressed. A fight commenced in the bathroom, and according to reports, his head was roughly slammed into the ground several times, apparently. He went to the hospital later that night. They spoke to police. Police tried to detract them from filing a report. And then after being released the next morning or the next day, they tragically passed away quite suddenly. And while the investigation and the autopsy and such are still under scrutiny and like people are, looking into it and the likes, authorities have not ruled out that the fight was the cause of death. We just learned that very recently. And the federal government, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, has opened a civil rights investigation into Owasso Public Schools. This comes after a complaint from the Human Rights Campaign that states that Owasso Public Schools and Oklahoma Public Schools in general have a very recent and very troubling pattern of abuse, harassment, and neglect towards its trans and non-binary students. For Next Benedict, he reported being bullied immediately after the bathroom ban in the state had gone into effect for trans youth in bathrooms in Oklahoma. We also learned from other students at that school, including one that posted on TikTok about it, that they had been misgendered by teachers, that they had been teased and harassed by teachers, that they had been sexually assaulted in Owasso Public Schools. And so, again, it's a pattern. And to see that now we have a trans youth who lost his life, it's a stunning indictment on the educational system under Superintendent Ryan Walters, who has also himself done a whole lot. And I could talk more and more about that. I'm sure you can prompt me.
Yes. Thank you for the rundown. Again, I can only imagine how taxing it is for you to have to be so connected to this and so many other tragic stories that I honestly, like just woman to woman, I just have so much respect for you. There is no clearer case. Well, there are a few actually, unfortunately. Let me rephrase that. This is a clear case of how direct the anti-trans legislation and non-corporeal conversations have very physical reactions. And you talked about the transphobia from teachers. So these are meant to be people of trusted positions. It's just such a clear-cut demonstration of how this anti-trans movement has already affected the lives of so many young trans people, let alone, obviously, everything. What I'd like to say here is everything that's not recorded. Unfortunately, the tragedy with Next Benedict got to the point that it was picked up by mass media, but would you agree there are so many examples of this happening that are just going to be undocumented across all of these terrible red, on your map, the red states? How big do you think that scale could be?
For instance, the Chaplain Bill, just to give your audience context on that. That is a bill in Texas, and we've seen other states consider it, that would allow religious chaplains to serve the role of school counselors. And you can imagine where we're going to run into issues there, especially in some of these really, really hyper-conservative places where religious chaplains explicitly oppose LGBTQ people as abominations. In terms of the direct connection between the extreme anti-trans rhetoric and Next Benedict's death, I want to highlight that Superintendent Ryan Walters, months before the death of Next Benedict, directed the Department of Education in Oklahoma to release a video calling trans people in bathrooms an assault on truth. The only person that was assaulted in a bathroom was Next Benedict. The other thing that I'll also add is that Ryan Walters put Chaya Raichik and Libs of TikTok into an official advisory role in the Department of Education, and stated whenever he appointed her that this was to improve school safety. Chaya Raichik, if your audience is not familiar with her, in the Libs of TikTok account, I'm sure many are, runs an account that essentially targets queer teachers, trans teachers, targets children's hospitals for having trans doctors. And after she targets them with editorialized commentary on video, these places by and large receive bomb threats, receive harassment, receive violent threats. We saw Boston Children's Hospital had to shut down entire wards of the Children's Hospital following her tweets. And here she gets put in charge of schools. Like, it's obscene. And we learned from reporting that students at Owasso Public Schools, where Next Benedict died, stated that their bullies, the ones that are the fiercest bullies in the school, are the ones that consume Libs of TikTok, that constantly read Chaya Raichik's materials. There's a direct connection, and it's very sad that it was allowed to go on in Oklahoma. I hope that the investigation corrects some things. It's going to be too late for Next, but we shouldn't lose any more students.
Absolutely. Talking then of Chaya Raichik and Libs of TikTok, again, thank you for the summary. The accountability that should be held. One thing I've always said on my channel, one of my stances is always that the right-wing kind of Republican side of things that are very anti-trans, very anti-LGBT and everything, they often have a kind of fake conversation kind of closer to home, the things they say out loud. And then there's the conversation that they don't really want to have, but it's the actions that they're very much moving towards. And how, to put it very bluntly, people like Ryan Walters and Chaya Raichik and Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, they want to see a world without trans people in them. They don't want to face the emotions that they have against trans people or for trans people or about maybe being a trans people. And they want to live in a world where that doesn't exist. Unfortunately, that is physically impossible. It's like trying to live in a world without rain. We're part of nature. And so how much do you... I mean, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that kind of issue of having the wrong conversations, because that, you know, we can talk till the cows come home about Chaya Raichek doing all these bad things. We know she's doing these bad things. We know she knows she's doing these things. So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts about, like, what are the real, how do we get to those real conversations? How do we get to the point where we can say, hold on, you're actively calling for trans people to die. Let's talk about that. Why is that okay? Why are you allowed to do that? You know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So part of my reporting is to make it easier to have that conversation. I often look for those moments where the mask slips,
Yes.
where they reveal their true intention. You know, I report it very early on Michael Knowles' statements calling for eradication. I've reported on Charlie Kirk stating that men should handle trans women the way that they did in the 1950s and 60s. Candace Owens calling trans people demons and stating that if she had a trans kid or something like that, she would beat them with a cane. You know, we hear these things and we know intuitively that the laws that they're trying to pass, they're designed to try to eradicate us, to try to remove us from the population. In fact, really recently, I reported on a conversation between state legislators. One representative, Gary Click in Ohio, who was responsible for the state gender affirming care ban for trans youth there, was speaking to legislators in Michigan. And the way that they talk whenever they think that nobody is listening, you can hear they say it full-throated. You know, we saw one of the representatives in that conversation say, yeah, but what about the end game? Like, we shouldn't let this be a thing for anybody. And then Representative Gary Click was like, yeah, but we got to do this piece by piece. We got to do this bit by bit. And they continually go back and forth about the end game. And you have Prisha Mosley come in saying that, yeah, adults, this shouldn't even be a thing for grownups. Like, this shouldn't be a thing for anybody. And, you know, these are people that are making the laws that are passing the laws that are eliminating access to healthcare. And so it's clear what they do. And yeah, you're right. They try to have like this one conversation while truthfully having this other one whenever they think that nobody's watching. We are watching. The other thing that I will say, and that I will add, is that they can't. They can hurt a lot of people, but they cannot remove trans people from the population because we are part of what it means to be human. You can no more eradicate trans people permanently than you can eradicate people with blonde hair permanently. We will continue to be born every single year to every new generation. We span human history and we always will.
That brings me to my next question, actually, speaking again of libs of TikTok and the danger behind the work you do. One of my friends, that when I mentioned I was lucky enough to get a call with you, she said about like, oh, you know, fascinated by her, love her work. How does she keep safe? How does she protect herself from doxing and stuff like that? I'm so sorry. Oh my God, I've just got to double check. Your pronouns are she, her, right?
Yeah, of course.
Oh my God. I did think that. I just had to, you know, when you just get a second of like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How do you have any kind of anti-doxing procedures in place? Like what do you have in place? Surely that must worry you.
Yeah. So, you know, this is a major issue. I've been targeted by libs of TikTok. I've been targeted by Matt Walsh explicitly. My name has been used and more. I have actually sparred back with both of them. They have not managed to land any real devastating blows on me. And there were a couple times where some of the feuds on Twitter turned into me ratioing her. Like, it was a thing.
I didn't know this.
I'm not afraid.
I'm not on Twitter, so I missed some of the best stuff. What happened?
It's a thing. So, but here's what I'll say. There's real danger in doing the work that I do. And, you know, there's already danger with journalism. You know, journalists often do come under fire, and people reporting on any contentious topic know that they do so at significant risk, often to their own life. And I will say that I've got hundreds of examples of people sending me threatening messages. I've had one person sending a message of like, I'm loading my gun with a picture of a gun. Like, you know, this is a thing that I have to deal with. I've been doxxed before. You know, there was one incident actually last year during the peak of my fiance's ordeal, which I don't know if you're familiar with my fiance, but if not, for your audience, my fiance is Representative Zoe Zephyr. She's the first transgender representative in the state of Montana, and she was silenced by the state legislature there in a very undemocratic fashion, made international news whenever it was happening. Yeah. While that was happening, both her and I had an attempt at swatting. The police officer had called me because I had actually very far in advance knew that this was a potential danger of the job. And I had contacted the police department and said, hey, look, I'm a prominent journalist on this very contentious topic. I've been doxxed and harassed before. I think it's a matter of time before somebody attempts to swat me. If that happens, here's my information. You can call me if you have any issue. And they did. They didn't show up to my house with a bunch of police officers. They called me, and we were able to confirm that it was just an attempt at swatting. But this has happened before. So how do I keep myself safe? There are methods that I'm not going to reveal here just so that they're not made publicly, but the things that I'll add publicly is that there are tools that you can use for your online presence. Delete Me is a really good one that I would highly recommend anybody who is a journalist to look into. It just removes public clearinghouse information that many people don't realize is online and freely available to anybody that wants to look it up. Secondarily, I have taken security steps to secure my home, to secure my family, to secure my person. But lastly, I realize that we as a community inherit a long history of resistance from people who faced far greater threats than even I or you. Whenever you look at the 1960s in Stonewall, whenever police could just walk into any place and arrest you for being gay, for wearing clothing that doesn't match your assigned sex at birth, there were still people who did this work. There always will be people who do this work. And I am undeterred by any of this. If anything, it makes my resolve greater because I want a world where my 8-year-old son grows up and can feel free to have queer friends, to be queer if he wants to be queer, to support their community and to feel safe. And that's the world that I'm trying to create.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you've got safety measures in place, and I will be right by your side fighting for the same world. I don't have children yet, and my husband and I are looking to adopt and have a family as soon as we can, as soon as we can afford it. And so, it's in the past few years I've been doing this work myself. The same thing. There's been a shift of I'm no longer doing it to protect myself. I'm doing it to make the world better for my children in the future and for my friends' children and for the next generation. So I completely mirror that. I'd love to talk about the effects of this being the spotlight in mass media, similar to it getting the attention from a lot of governments that have nothing else to talk about. It's like the New York Times, stuff like that. We have our own versions in the UK, but they are also media that's some cases, I would say, media that you expect it from. But then again, the BBC has had a completely crazy kind of transphobic swerve. And it's the same kind of prestige of mass media as probably the New York Times, or even bigger. But what's your opinion on that? Do you think it's a case of follow the money, and that a lot of these places are connected to people that are wealthy and anti-trans, or is there something else to it? What's your stance on that?
I think there's a few things at play with media coverage. I definitely think part of it is follow the money. I think that part of it is also that the New York Times has never had a good record on trans and queer issues. It took them, for instance, a very long time to use the word gay. It took them, there was one article, I think it was in the 1990s or the late 1980s, where they called transsexuals an infestation in Central Park. So this is something that they've had a long history of really negative coverage towards. And I think that sometimes that surprises people whenever it reemerges, because the outlet has previously been thought to be a more liberal outlet. I'll also say that there is a sort of the best way to put this? I think that there's a sort of ethos in current cisgender normative journalism around finding a neutral middle and declaring that neutral middle truth. And many times, that neutral middle is very artificially made out to be truth. Whenever you put, for instance, a climate denier up against a World Climate Organization in the same article and try to seek a middle and call that truth, you're not doing service to your audience. Yep. And very similarly, you're seeing that with trans issues and the coverage of trans issues, I think, in the Times. If you look in the history of journalism, the reason why the sort of both sides declaring a middle ground as truth happened, the reason why that emerged naturally in journalism is not because of some sort of journalistic ethics that make you have to find a middle ground that is truth. It's because of advertisers. Advertisers wanted to make sure that they were not advertising on a paper that was seen as too liberal or too conservative, because that could hurt their brand. Right. And so there's an economic incentive to basically artificially create these middle grounds, even where they don't exist. And it is a thing that exists for trans people and coverage for trans issues, but it's also something that's not unique to us. We see this in all kinds of coverage on many contentious topics.
You said climate change is a great one, until we have things like Jubilee in the world, which just to me are wild. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. That kind of something else I would want to talk about, but I won't dive too into it. But yes, I think the just the centralist way of platforming two sides when it's just clear that one is advocating for the genocide of a human, of a race of people, and then the other is just existing, and so I think it's a very good point. I think though, that has started to come to light. I've seen a lot of people talk about that, especially on the left, starting to organize and saying I'm not going to platform someone that is trying to meet me halfway in a discussion of my existence. That's not going to happen. And so it's nice to see people waking up to that. It's really interesting that you said that the cause of that though is advertising. And I think, like we were saying about the fascist uprising and stuff like that that's happening now, I wonder how many connections we can all make to this late stage capitalist hellscape that we live in, and how I've even seen a lot of right wing pundits push very eerily anti-capitalist issues, and to be you have no money, inflation's really high, everyone's got 3 jobs and rent's crazy, and it's because of the trans people, and it's oh well, hold on, I was with you until that last one, and so I wonder how to the wider scale of the mass public, everyone is feeling the effects of late stage capitalism. It's insane at the moment, and yet again, we're seeing this middle ground conversation of it's because we haven't gone back to old ways where we just had men and women in the world, and then it's or is it CEOs and inflation and climate crisis?
No, absolutely, and it's wild how this sort of fascist wing of the Republican Party has very much taken a very orthogonal position to the capitalist libertarian Republican Party that we also know and love, that has its own issues as well. We see them go, we saw this, you go all the way back to the rise of Nazism in Germany. We see this is a tactic. This is a tactic that has been used for generations to other people who you want to blame for all of the social problems on. And very similarly today, we are seeing not only the blaming on trans people, but we're also seeing the sort of attacking of companies that platform a trans person, that allow a trans person to speak, that feature a trans representative or something like that. They're not beholden to any one economic philosophy. Instead, they are very much beholden to a particular explanation for social ills. And they point to us as one of the perpetuators of degeneracy that they blame for all of the problems that people face.
I want to talk about the us and them element, because as someone who is trying to obviously stop the anti-trans movement, of course, but also in a way, in a method that doesn't advocate for the same harm back. And I think that's something that's really important to say, especially on YouTube, that like we should never advocate for the same thing back or harm towards someone else. And I know there's much more to it than that. I'm not claiming civility politics, but how do you feel about the kind of how do you work towards not dehumanizing the other side and doing the same thing back at them and saying these are just evil people, these are monsters? Like I had a roommate once that said Donald Trump is an evil monster, and I heard that and I thought, when they say that about us, it's like, oh, hold on, you're dehumanizing us. So how do you kind of tackle that same stigma on the other side? What's your thought there?
Of course. So, as a journalist, I have a duty to the truth, and I center my discussion on engaging with information, engaging with the facts, engaging with the lived reality, the body of research, and the actual stories of what goes on in these legislatures. You'll note that in my writing, I often feature source documents, and that's a big part of what I do. I want people to have access not just to like my own take on what's going on. I want them to be able to watch the video of the hearing. I want them to be able to read the bill itself. I want them to see things as they are. And I truly think that like this is part of how you help get people to a new place. It's I don't think it's as fruitful to engage in like the constant back and forth of like name calling and stuff like that. I think that like it can feel empowering. And again, I'm not like you, I'm not going to play civility politics. And if that is what it takes for somebody to move forward with dealing with the harassment and the stress and all the things that we get from those who oppose our existence, then by all means. For me, I tend to find that the best way for me to move people into a new direction is to meet them, like I said very early on in our discussion here, where they are. I find where they are and I try to move that needle just a little bit. And moving the needle may mean something different for each person. Moving the needle for my mom, who took 3 to 4 years to call me by my name, might be getting her to call me by my name for the first time. Whereas moving the needle for someone who is an ally might be to explain, the broader issues in transgender sports participation, where they might have like some difficulty understanding. Yeah. And I try to do that by meeting them where they are and presenting them with information that maybe they have not heard yet.
Amazing. That's a great point I wanted to highlight from what you were saying in the middle of that, of like, there's a difference between dehumanizing that person for who they are as a person and belittling their misinformed ideals or debunking the kind of the facts that they're bringing that are incorrect and the misinformation. Like, I think that's a great differentiation actually of rebutting someone, Matt Walsh, for example, Candace Owen, saying, actually, what you're saying is absolute rubbish. It's not based in statistics, or the data you've brought to the table is wrong, is a different thing to saying Matt Walsh as a person should be dehumanized. And I think that's a fantastic differentiation. Thank you for that. That really is what I was looking for, actually, because it can be so easy to slip. And I think even people in the community often do slip between that very difficult line.
And I think like another thing is often, the dehumanization itself is, it's a particularly important thing for me to point to as evidence that this is not something that's based in truth. This is not something that's based in fact. It's very much based in hate, and it harms the anti-trans side. Like, I think that it does them more of a disservice than many of them will admit. Whenever we hear legislators that have claimed to be acting on truth and on like evidence that's being suppressed privately say that they want end of this for everyone, that they want trans eradication, that they want an elimination, that undercuts them. And why would we undercut ourselves?
Absolutely. Well said. When we are just existing, I think that's the main point. Fantastic. Well said. The 10 stages of genocide is kind of where we're also on this. And I always like to make the disclaimer of obviously the understanding of what's happening across the world in various countries and how the stages are sadly much more progressing in other places. But just talking a moment for the transgender community and the anti-trans movement we've seen. Talk a bit about, if you will, about the different ways in which they're trying to eradicate trans people. So be that medically preventing, access to trans affirming care, or legally preventing, the changing of documentation. How many different ways are they trying to do it, and what are those ways?
Yeah, of course. Let me open up by saying that we do see the rhetoric nationally around eradication, around the end of existence for trans people. That is the goal for many people. That's the goal for some of the lead figures in the anti-trans movement. They've stated so openly. As I've mentioned some examples earlier, and there are many more. It's also the end goal for many of their most ardent followers that boost this stuff, that post hate on a daily basis on Twitter and in social media. And the laws that they are enacting are similarly designed to do that. We see laws right now in the United States that draw upon laws that were passed in Russia 3-4 years ago targeting trans people. Things that we saw condemnation of here in the United States. And now we're seeing a sort of metastasis of anti-trans rhetoric and anti-trans bills here that do the same thing. Things like ending all legal recognition, ending all gender transition, and more. The goal, as we've on numerous cases here, is for eradication. And the means by which to do that are warned against by the UN Council on Genocide, by the Holocaust Museum, and more. They specifically point out how regimes of restricting your ability to move in public life, targeting your children for potentially being stripped from you. We saw in Texas, Ken Paxton just 2 years ago swept Child Protective Services agents across the state to look for trans kids that could be receiving gender affirming care, and pulled them aside, interrogated them for hours. Thankfully, that was blocked in court. But had that not been blocked in court, kids would have been forcibly removed by the government. This is troubling. This is problematic in so many ways.
Insane.
And then we're starting to see forced identification. There's a reason why Abbott wanted a list of all trans people on the PFLAG membership rolls. There's a reason why he has gone to the DMV and asked for all trans people that have changed their gender marker documents. There's a reason why Iowa wants special gender markers on birth certificates and driver's licenses. There's a reason why Florida is trying to do similar in the state by trying to revoke driver's licenses if you're not charged with fraud. These are targeting your ability to move, your ability to exist in public. And it is a sort of elimination by attrition. They're trying to make life so hard that trans people feel like they've got to give up, either by giving up their transition or giving up their lives. And, that is what we are currently seeing. And I think that, being very observant of early threats to our existence is very prudent, not just here, but globally. And I will add that globally, trans people are seeing extreme attacks. In Russia, where we're seeing them sent to the front lines in war, we're seeing them removed all of their medical care. We're seeing, we recently saw the first arrests of people with rainbow flag earrings in Russia, for instance. We see this in several countries right now. And this is what we are currently dealing with.
How did we get here? Why is it this bad now? And why are we in this position now?
One thing that I note, because I do get asked, this is, I think, my most common question that I get asked anytime I speak. And one thing that I will note is that while we are in a very difficult period right now, this is a recurring story in human history whenever it comes to queer people. It seems like we fall into these cycles of moral panic around queer people every 10 to 20 years. And sometimes they're worse than others. Sometimes they're very bad. I look at the pictures of the trans women sitting around the table in the El Dorado in 1928 Berlin, and they're smiling and happy. And like, I know what comes next. I see the pictures of the book burnings and the rise of fascism in Germany. And in fact, in Germany, the seventh publication of Der Stürmer, which was the Nazi publication in the early rise of fascism in Germany, the 7th issue, so one of their very earliest issues, had a big picture of Magnus Hirschfeld, the leader of the Institute of Sexology, the first trans clinic in the world, with claims that he was grooming kids. Like, this all comes full circle.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, in the 80s, the gay panic and the homosexual teachers and the same thing. Like you said, it's a recurrence in history. And so to try and be optimistic then about what it is different then, would you say that this is a backlash for what has been a more globally progressive movement across the whole of the LGBTQIA plus community? We're seeing, gay marriages, we're seeing trans medical care even existing. I mean, bear in mind, 100 years ago, medically transitioning was not the same thing as it is now in the West, mostly. Would you say this is a backlash from outdated, and I'm going to say religious-based ideology? And in that sense, then, do you think that they will eventually run out of fuel because, it's an outdated mindset for a reason?
I absolutely think that is part of what is going on. I think that the religious aspect of things is very prevalent. We see the Catholic Medical Association feature very heavily in the anti-trans laws globally, for instance. I'll also say that, I think that a large amount of the backlash, or the large amount of like the rise of fascism around the world, is targeted towards, or in part towards, the LGBTQ community. But I'll also add that more broadly, we are seeing a rise in fascism. We're seeing targeting of not just the queer community, but of immigrants, of disabled people, of indigenous people, and more. And this is, I think that there are broad forces at work here. And I think that trans and queer people are an acute symptom of that, are an acute focus of the rise of fascist governments internationally. And there are very troubling signs. There are red flags about where we are heading right now. And I want to be very clear and acknowledge that. I mean, things could get as bad as they can get. That is on the table right now. I think that queer and trans people are absolutely one of the focal points, not the only focal point. There are several focal points here, but we are one of them.
Would you even go as far as to say that we are acting as the canary in the coal mine for what fascism could bring?
Absolutely. And in fact, I think that is a very good analogy, because we have seen this before. Again, I mentioned the book burnings that happened in Germany. Whenever you see those black and white pictures, so often they never tell you what books they are burning. Those were the very first 30 years of trans research. That they were the first book burnings done in the rise of fascism in Germany. Same within the 1960s and 70s. We saw the targeting of trans people and gay people in queer clubs, which portended a very tumultuous backlash period, reactionary period in the 1970s globally. And I think we're seeing it again today. And we do tend to act as that canary in the coal mines. People, they focus on us, and then they sweep broadly and target anybody who's different, anybody that challenges very cis, heterosexual, patriarchal, normative notions of what it means to exist as a human being in public.
For sure. And I think if this video, just talking to the audience for a second, if it gets big enough that it it leaves my ecosystem and cis people, allies, people unaware, people watching what's happening and thinking it's not going to affect them. I think this is a great conversation to really perk up your ears to, because like we've seen with the anti-abortion situation and the updates with that, with the embryo status and stuff, it's like there's no way that this movement is going to end with the LGBTQIA plus community, and we're heading towards a Handmaid's Tale dystopia. And if people are watching thinking they're going to stop at the trans people and then everything's going to just move on, it's like, no, of course not. These people have a very, very specific worldview that they want to see, and even if you fit within it, it's not going to be the world we all know and or anything based on reality. So in that sense, then my next question here. So for someone that might not be aware of the US kind of political situation specifically, we talk a lot about the Republican Party and the right-wing people doing this, and yet Biden and the Democrats are in power. So contrasting to the UK, we have the Tories in power, who are the more right-wing version, and the Labour Party, what would be the Democrats, are just less left. They're very close centre right, especially on trans issues. Some of them are quite transphobic themselves. Why does the US see so much of this coming from the right wing, the Republican Party, stuff like that, when they're not even in power? And obviously you can probably see where I'm going with this. What potential situation could we face if they were to get in power later this year?
Yeah. And, there are some very interesting nuances around this conversation around the powers of the presidency and like what can be done and what is not being done. And I want to be clear that there are things that are not being done that should be done federally. But then also, we do have a court system that was stacked in the last 10 years by Donald Trump. And we have courts that are extremely right-wing here that they are now using their sort of ecosystem that they've built up to try to shift the American public forcibly to the right on trans issues and on all religious issues. And so, we do see that. Now, Democrats have acted as I think, important stopgap, as an important break to the worst legislation, both in the blue states where we've seen positive legislation, even in the red states where they've resisted some of the worst bills. And nationally, we have not seen anti-trans legislation yet by the Democrats at all. And in fact, they have stood fairly resolutely against such legislation so far. The real question is, will they continue to? We just saw John Fetterman, for instance, support the closing of an LGBTQ clinic after it came under attack by lids of TikTok. And so we do have that. Now, if Republicans do take power nationally, I know a lot of people that are very concerned. I know a lot of people that have gotten their passports specifically because of fear around that. The writing is on the wall for what could be done. We had Donald Trump specifically say that he would go after hormone therapy providers, like the manufacturers themselves. That could threaten supply of hormone therapy, not just for trans people here. That could threaten it globally. These manufacturers are often in the United States, and so this is not something that's going to be limited here. And we're all affected by this. Everybody in the United States, everybody globally who is queer or trans, we're all in this boat right now.
Everyone that wants to avoid nuclear war. I mean, I know it's
exactly. These issues go way beyond trans people.
Of course, I think the real truth no one, especially in the US, wants to admit is that we've had a superpower in the form of the US for so long. It's losing its superpower status. And it's a matter of, is it going to fight its way down, or is it going to not, really? And that's how it looks from my perspective. And that is a petrifying question, really. I don't think we've seen, like you said about the rise of fascism, I don't think we've seen anywhere near close to the potential backlash. But yeah, going to get me hyped up and angry in a minute. Let me calm myself down. So, I mean, we're dancing around the topic as well of Project 2025. What I'd like to somehow keep anything positive that we can. So what weaknesses do you see in Project 2025? What kind of rays of hope are there? I know that's a weird question. Forgive me for asking it, but yeah.
No, you're fine. You're fine. The one thing I will say is that the reaction to Project 2025 has shown that I don't think that anti-trans and outright fascist rhetoric in that document that basically states that it would remake the American governmental system, would broaden the powers of the presidency, would, this is stuff that is very endgame type stuff here, to borrow a Republican word from earlier in this conversation. I don't think that most people read that and go, yeah, that's the world I want to live in. Yeah, that's the government I want to live in. And most conversations around Project 2025 have shown that it isn't something that has widespread support. But it represents a real threat because they're not necessarily beholden to widespread support. Trans issues, for instance, in the United States, if you poll on this, most people say they don't really care about them. It's not that they oppose us or are for us. Like, you can poll each individual topic and you'll find maybe some like polls where people are against us on an issue or for us on an issue. But the real polls that show that, like, even if they are, they don't really care. They don't want to target us. They don't want to spend time on this.
Not a vote swaying issue. Yeah.
Exactly. But for the Heritage Foundation, that doesn't really matter because they have millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars that they get to spend on this topic. And it represents a threat. But I also think that by shining a light on those threats, we can maybe show people what's at stake here. And I'm going to do that until we get to the election and then past it.
For sure. That actually was my next question. I wanted to talk about that, about in the polls. I mean, we saw Ron DeSantis get completely annihilated by sticking to that talking point, really, and also because he was a bit of a schmuck, but that's a separate question. In the UK, we have, again, the Tories in power that have been in power for a long time. They've pushed so much austerity and have just bled the country dry, really, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we see a lot of the politicians in power and the money and the connections they've had. And so the anti-trans movement in the UK, we get the sense that it's kind of the only thing they have to even talk about. They don't want to make any actual policies. They don't want to tax the wealthy. They don't want to make any systems better. So as a government, they have nothing to say, other than steal more money from people and distract people with this anti-trans rhetoric. We have now, obviously, you've seen, I'm sure, Rishi Sunak, the PM, as openly transphobic now as J.K. Rowling, which is saying something in 2024. So do you think it's a similar thing in the US, or do you think it kind of is a bit more insidiously rooted in actual worldview and belief that trans people shouldn't exist?
I think it's interesting here in the United States because, yeah, like we see actual worldviews that trans people shouldn't exist, but we also see a resistance to that in many places. In these hearings, for instance, I often note that when anti-trans legislation is brought forward, you will see 2 or 3 people stand up in favor of the legislation and speak, and hundreds will speak out against it, even in the most conservative states. Like, we're talking Oklahoma, we're talking Missouri, Florida. These places are filled with people that are coming out saying, no, this is not what we want you to do. And they range from Republicans to Democrats. They range from, I've seen the last one that I watched one in Missouri where there was literally like an ex-Army veteran and like, he was a conservative, libertarian Republican and came out saying like, I didn't fight for my country to see this, like, don't do this. And I don't think that, I don't think that they enjoy that sort of popular support. I don't think that this is something that is, but what I will say is that you're right. They are spending so much time on it because they have nothing else to offer. I mentioned that I am tracking 500 bills right now targeting the community. This is in addition to 500 more from last year. There is not a single topic out there, not one, that you can do a search in the bill depository for and 500 bills on. There's nothing like that. Like, you know, they spend so much time on this. We saw in Nebraska, they spent 82 days of legislative time trying to break a filibuster on a trans bill because they had nothing else to offer. And I think that this is actually where the Republican Party sees its losses on this. Because we've seen a very a huge number of electoral losses on candidates that have focused on this issue from the Republican Party. You mentioned DeSantis in the primary, but I will also add that, you know, we saw Andy Beshear in Kentucky. We saw Judge Janet Protasiewicz in Wisconsin. We saw the Virginia legislature flip. We saw the Michigan legislature flip on this issue. We saw Georgia Herschel Walker lost whenever he brought on Riley Gaines. We saw in Arizona, Governor Hobbs, they attacked her husband for providing therapy to a trans kid. So like, this is something they continue to try to do. And Moms for Liberty, which has been a big discussion the last 2 years, they lost 70% of their races nationwide, including in very important swing districts. And so I think that whenever they focus so hard on this, it becomes so clear that they're not going to help you in any way. These people are not here to make law that improves your life. They're here for one purpose, and it's to target a group of people because they got nothing else to offer.
Yeah.
And I'll close off by saying that in Bucks County, in Pennsylvania, where Moms for Liberty lost all but 2 seats, as soon as they lost their power to go after trans kids, they resigned. They fought for a re-election, but they realized that they had no more power on the board, and so they just left the board because they didn't actually care about kids. Like, that's not something that they didn't want to actually improve the school system. They just wanted to have the power so they could pass the anti-trans law.
Well, absolutely. And as you just mentioned there, like we spoke about earlier, they're having the real conversations, really actually calling them out for what they really want to do, really just brings to light the fact that this isn't about protecting kids. Like you've said, their end game is to pass this further than children. So it's not about protecting kids at all. And if it were, they're doing a terrible job. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Wow, that is an amazing ending as well to the main stuff I wanted to talk about. I always somehow end up on talking about late stage capitalism, and it's the problem with everything. Before I ask a couple personal things that I can't wait to talk about, what's the kind of positive thing that's happened recently, especially kind of with the anti-trans movement in mind? Like, what ray of hope do you have? How do you think we can get through it? And you know, what active actions are there?
I think that young people are going to save the fucking world. Honestly,
Me too.
That is what gives me hope. I have conversations. I get to see them whenever I'm presenting at like a high school or something like that, or whenever they come up to us after we're speaking at an organization. I watch them in the United States. You know, there was a group of queer under 26-year-olds who basically led the largest Trans Day of Visibility marches in U.S. history. And just, this is a story that I tell often, but, you know, last year, I got a message from a trans girl in Louisiana, which is where I was born and raised, a very conservative place, very rural, where 20 years ago I was bullied heavily. And she said, "Hey, Erin, I love your work. Thank you so much for what you do. And I just wanted to tell you, I'm a 17-year-old trans girl. I go to this high school," and it was like a place that's 20 minutes from where I grew up. And she said, "And I just wanted to let you know I was nominated to the homecoming court." And I cried because, like, I know what it was like growing up there. I know how hard it was. And to see that, like, where I grew up in one of the toughest places, not only as a trans girl being accepted, but celebrated and loved. Like, her dad was driving her around in a car around the stadium and she's waving to everybody in her dress. Like, young people are going to change the world. I truly believe it.
Me too. Me too. They have to. They just have to. Personal question for me. I am a huge fan of the Majority Report, and I have obviously seen you feature a couple of times on there. What was it like talking to Emma and Sam and the team? Like, I'd love to just hear about it from your perspective of your account of things.
The Majority Report was amazing, and this is the second time I've been on it.
Yeah.
Speaking to them is great. I've had conversations with them on background as well and given them information. They do really good work, and it's interesting because prior to going on the show, I actually I had not watched a lot of their stuff. I didn't know how big they were. I didn't know how big of a following and how dedicated of a audience they had. And I very quickly learned after appearing on it, I got messages from several friends of mine who were like, I saw you on Majority Report. It was really cool. So I'm glad to be able to go on there and talk to them about all the issues.
Yeah, it was amazing. I saw both times you were on there, and I think on my channel I was kind of the same. I've seen of Majority Report, but I hadn't watched them too much. But then I ended up turning into this weekly Majority Report reaction stuff, especially when the whole TYT Anna Kasparian thing was happening. But Emma Vigiland's just unadulterated stand for the trans community, she would say things that even I hadn't quite got my head around, and I would be like, oh yeah, that's why. Oh my goodness, she was helping me undo some of my internal transphobia. She's amazing.
She was wonderful.
Yeah. Oh well, amazing. I'm glad to hear that it was a great experience as well, because
it really was.
Just you never know what it's like in the real situation. That's amazing to hear. Yeah. So tell us where anyone that might not have already done so, where we can find your amazing coverage. What would you like to publicize? Just anything at all.
Of course, erininthemorning.com is where I cover all of my legislation, news updates, and more. You can also follow me at Erin in the Morn on Twitter, TikTok, Erin in the Morning on Instagram, and wherever you get your news at. I'm going to try to bring it to you.
Amazing. Well, I will be, of course, sure to put that information in the description below. Thank you so much for all of your time. It's been, honestly, from a really personal perspective, it's been so really assuring to just speak to someone else that's in the same field and just to kind of unpick some of the gaslighting that we just have on a daily basis. So from a personal, from my personal perspective, thank you so much. I'm trying to think if there's anything else while I've got you. Thank you for finding my channel. I can't believe how you were watching an episode about Japan, which is was it the one where I was talking about that to the Tabernacle, or was it literally just one where I'm talking about my experiences of getting misgendered and stuff? There's only a couple.
It's not the misgendered one. I did catch the misgendered one. I didn't watch that one very much, but I watched the one that was just about your experiences in Japan, and it was really fascinating to me. Amazing. I was like, oh, this is really cool. This is really helping me understand the situation there and what it's like living there.
If you ever do come and visit, and I mean this really genuinely, we live in a place called Osaka, which is down the west of it. Even though if you were in Tokyo, I think I would fly up just to come and meet you. If you wanted a tour guide, if you wanted some recommendations, anything at all, I honestly mean that.
Awesome. Well, I will let you know if Zoe and I come. There's a decent chance that we're going to come to Japan either this year or next year on our honeymoon. So.
Oh, really? That's a great selection.
We will see what we choose. It's either going to be Japan or France this year.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. Two amazing destinations. But yeah, and equally, if you need any, if you do decide for Japan, or if you want some recommendations or places,
absolutely. I will 100%. I'll come to you.
I'm honestly your girl for that. That's my thing.